Hello and welcome to Building Brand Advocacy, the podcast where we just nerd out on all things brand building and customers, advocacy, brands, and basically how they evolve, how they are to be built today, how they have been built, and how they're going to be built tomorrow. And today I'm incredibly excited to be joined by my friend David Mannheim. David, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Your mic sounds really good, by the way.
Oh, thanks. Your mic sounds really good as well. Cheers. We've been nerding out for a little bit of time on microphones, and now we're going to nerd out on brands and consumer behaviors. Like David is the go-to, probably one of the top voices in the UK, at the very least, if not the world, on personalization. Built an incredibly successful agency, sold that, and has written a book on it. It has a really interesting tech product that's around the space. And yeah, what he doesn't know about this isn't worth knowing. But before we get into all those kind of things, I want to start off like, you're occasionally maybe a grumpy northerner. Can we say that?
Yeah, polite but grumpy.
Yeah, polite but grumpy, delightful but a little bit grumpy. Like what pisses you off?
So many things. But I think in the context of what we're going to talk about, I'm going to just go with like the staple word of greed. Greed really bothers me. I understand that money makes the world go round and it's business 101 to make a profit. But when that's at the expense of other things, a guest experience, a customer experience, I know I get really irked. And my relationship with greed was really born out, I think, out of COVID, being honest. I could trace it back to two specific things, which is Disney and Manchester United. So
Both famously greedy organizations, I'd say. Which one do you want to get into?
huge Disney fan. Also, like United, have been going every year. Well, since I was born, I've been 35 times, and I'm only 36. But I love it, and I take my kids, and they don't like it, but we force them to go. Anyway, this affinity with Disney is so much so that I'm like a sycophant. I will go regardless of what happens. Now, when COVID comes along, closes the parks, Disney get this opportunity to almost do whatever it is that they'd like. Okay, and to introduce like new regimes, new structures, new processes, new upcharges, new ways of working, because it's like a hard stop. They couldn't have naturally introduced what I'm about to tell you about that break that COVID gave them. So they used it as an excuse. And I'm sure you've probably heard this like term of like a pandemic excuse or a COVID excuse, which all brands seems to be leaping on nowadays. So Disney introduced this new way of working called Genie Plus, which was a personalization app that allowed you, in theory, to structure your day in the parks. You're a thrill seeker, so we're going to recommend you go on Splash Mountain, followed by Thunder Mountain, followed by this and that and that. Great. Or, you like the royal treatment, you love the princesses, so Princess Tiana's just around the corner, go and meet her, and then go on Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs Mine Train, and you'll be, this is for you, this is designed for you. They announced this pre-COVID. What we got 4 years later, post-COVID, was something very, very different. We got this app that wasn't designed to personalize your day, but it was designed for upcharges, and they had this experience called a Fast Pass pre-COVID. Allowed you to skip the queue of 3 rides of your choice per day, completely complimentary. They replaced that with a paid for experience. This is what the Genie app enabled them to do. So instead of it being free, they now charge for that. And it's literally up to $25 per person per day extra. When this was introduced, the average spend of the customer increased in their parks year on year by 40% pre and post COVID. It's a 40% increase. If you were spending $100 pre COVID, you now spend $140 post COVID for the same experience. For me, that doesn't feel right. So when we're talking about, why are you so emotional about this? I feel like my two loves have bugged me over, being honest with you, Disney and United. They've trumped the guest or the fan experience for commercialism.
But I mean, commercialism, I run a business, you run a business. We work with brands who are all businesses, like these guys got to exist, and the game is to make money. In most cases, like what could they have done differently?
Think about the short-termism that exists within companies, particularly those that are VC backed. So Disney's VC backed, like by BlackRock, and all the huge companies like that. They expect growth from somewhere. Now, how do you grow a theme park? A theme park that has a limited capacity, okay, to 90,000 a day, you either squeeze more into it or you charge more for what you already have. It's just got to the point where it's so overt in the latter, and the fact that they can get away with it because of sycophants and nostalgic fools like myself that will continue to go regardless. It feels dirty. It feels like they are ruining the brand experience and replacing it with numbers. If I'm honest, there's something where short-termism beats loyalty, where the notion of overt nickel and diming beats retention, long-termism. Because in the case of, say, the Glazers who own United or Bob Chapek who's running Disney, they know that they're not going to be here in 5, 10, or 20 years. So the easiest, best, quickest, most efficient way of doing what they need to do to release their own value is to charge more for the same experience or a lesser experience.
And that long termism, I definitely agree on it. And I find it fascinating that some of the biggest, most successful brands in the world are still being led by the same founder. And it's the mindset of actually what do you build a business to be. So even if you're looking at a Nike, Phil Knight was there for a very long time. You're
Yeah,
looking at Lululemon. You've got Chip Wilson before he got kicked out, but he'd still be kicking around now if given the choice, I'm sure. And then you look at all the software giants that do incredibly well. Salesforce with Benioff. You've got Oracle still has Larry Ellison around, however many 30, 40 years later.
yeah,
And that's a company that's worth $250 billion. In fact, it's probably worth more than that, but by now, like that approach, that founder led, that has that mentality versus the kind of caretaker CEO that's coming in, like is that something which is jeopardizing the way that brands are operating on a day-to-day basis? I mean, do you have a better alternative?
I think the word is balance, surely. And okay, I've never ran a huge PLC. I am an investor in people like Disney, for example. And if you want to go and take a look at the stock, you'll see it's the lowest it's been in 25 years. People are cotton and go. If you want to look at customer satisfaction scores, it's the lowest it's been in 25 years. Again, for this reasons, but people people aren't correlating the two, or they're focusing more on the short term versus the long term, as I mentioned, right? So I think the word just comes down to balance, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, I do agree, but I think for me, it's about value being
For who?
exchanged. So for the consumer, for whoever the buyer is, I mean, consumer, this would also be from a B2B perspective. Like if someone is giving you value above and beyond where you would have been previously, you'd be very happy to pay for it. But if they are capturing you and squeezing you, that's a different experience. And I think that sounds like one of those ones with Disney is that, yeah, you want to go, they've got you locked in, you're going to go, but whilst you're there, they're going to make you really squeeze. I mean, they already did. It was already eye-wateringly expensive to go for a trip. But the inverse of this is someone who's providing a service, and that is going to be creating such a value to you that, yeah, you want to pay more for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Those things are very, very different.
Yeah. So what you think the answer comes down to this magic word of value, which is an
Yeah.
intangible and sensible thing, right? It's ethereal. It's something that might not be easily attributable, and I do feel as though, I write about in my book, Paul, the some of the reasons why short-termism beats long-termism, or the difference between retention and loyalty, because the two are different. Uh, it's much easier to attribute an immediate sale, for example, than it is to attribute customer lifetime value. It's always been very difficult, or multi-touch attribution. The way somebody feels is just completely intangible, as opposed to, I don't know, an exchange of pounds and pence from my pocket to yours. Um, I, I, I just find it fascinating. Like, for example, Paul, are there any companies that you would feel as though you should call out for being so overt in, I'm going to call it greediness?
Yeah, quite a few. The ones that always spring to mind for me are the ones that go through a private equity cycle. And it's that short-term approach of they buy it at one level and then they sell at another level, and you can just tell the behavior that is happening. But there is a playbook. There's a lot of smart stuff that happens when a private equity company comes in. They are operations. They bring in great operators and they tighten things up and they squeeze out the value for it, and then they go and they flip it. But it tends to be that they often lose out on a lot of that long-termist approach, the thing that actually really got to the brand to that level there. And the kind of consumer brand landscape is littered with brands that did really well. It got to a point where they got on a brand's radar, a PE company's radar. They sold, and then they started going backwards, because what it was, they lost the passion, they lost the heart, they lost the community of the humans that felt something for that brand. And then they started trying to commercialize that and churn it out and make it something they could expand into other areas that they didn't necessarily have a core in as well. So
they lost it. I think trust. They lost the trust of the consumer. And if you ever look at like the Edelman Trust Barometer, which is the most widely known trust scoring factor globally today, you'll see that social media is the lowest, banks is the second lowest, and e-commerce is the third lowest. The government are in there as well, as you can imagine, public figures, that type of thing. But there's a reason why we don't trust these brands. Black Friday, for example, there's some research in my book that talks about 93% of all Black Friday deals are false. They're dressed up because they're there for a purpose, like an immediate short-termist purpose. No wonder that we don't trust these brands when stats like that come out. Why do they do it? You know, it's all down to purpose, surely.
Well, let's dig into that a little bit more. So talk me through that research. Like, where did that come from? Like, how was that research conducted, and how did you come to that? Because that's super interesting.
You've put me on the spot there, but I'm pretty certain from memory it's from HBR, Harvard Business Review, and it was in conjunction with the Edelman Trust Barometer Index of, at that time, 2022, and they spoke about in the article or the research that the RRP is often inflated. There's inclusions of things like VAT and delivery costs that are hidden within the saving, quote unquote. From memory, those were the two main things. But they spoke about the consumer's trust with brands or e-commerce in general, and how that related to purchase cycles and, I don't know, the lack of loyalty towards a specific brand. And I used the word before, I said that there's a difference between retention and loyalty. Retention is a repeat visit, a repeat purchase. And just because you purchase something from, say, Amazon, does not mean that you are loyal to them. I think there's a big differentiator between the two. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, I mean, we're all part of 100 loyalty programs. How can you be loyal to 100 brands?
Yeah, exactly. There's probably, there's some research recently created that in your Facebook circle of 1,000, 1,000, probably for you 30,000 friends, there are only 3 that you can count on nowadays, and that's diminished from 5 a couple of years ago, and then 9 a few years ago before that. So like our circle of trust is diminishing and diminishing and diminishing. I feel the same is true of brands, which is there are probably only a couple that you can rely on or that you can trust. If I speak to you and say, Paul, which are the handful of brands that you feel most closely affiliated to and loyal to, what would you say to that?
I think there are. I'm looking around me for inspiration because you've put me on the spot. I'd say Levi's are pretty reliable. I can get the same pair of jeans that have probably been made for the past 50 years or whatever that is. I think there is some sort of trust that happens with Apple. I hate when people refer to Apple as a brand and one to look to, but there's one right in front of me, and it's like, well, okay, hang on, that's like the 5th I've had in a row, and that phone's like the 10th I've had in a row or something. And I went to Android, and it was fine, but it wasn't quite as good in almost every way. Like minuscule amounts, but just minuscule amounts just off. And so I went back again. And so there is a certain amount of trust that I know that they're going to show up for my life, and provide that security that's a staple. And that's actually something that I'm looking for there when I'm thinking about these brands. This isn't something which I'm showing off to the world. This isn't a status piece that shows to my tribe whom I am. This is something that I need. I need trousers. I need to call people. I need to use WhatsApp. So
Interesting. So in your affinity towards those brands, use the word reliable. Talk to me about that. Why reliable? Because the reliable is like a Maslow hierarchy need, right? It feels like fairly at the bottom of those. And it
Mhm.
doesn't feel like it's a self-actualization, a part of your identity.
Yeah, it is. It's a foundational piece. Exactly. It's exactly like you're saying. It is there. It's the same as food. It's the same as shelter. It's the same as companionship that sits in there, rather than going towards the higher end of that pyramid. I know that they're going to show up, and I know that they're going to do what I need them to do when I need them to do what I need them to do.
Okay. So that's known as something called competence. There's a book called The Human Brand by two researchers, Malone and Fisk, and they speak about the vast majority of purchase intent and trust towards a brand being comprised of two factors: competency and care. And care outstrips that of competency. Competency is like, can somebody do something? Can you help? Care is, will you help? And I think that constitutes more about the trust between a consumer and a brand than, say, competency. It just so happens that a lot of the brands nowadays have pure competency and don't explicitly demonstrate care, which impacts the Edelman trust barometer, i.e., the difference between the trust between a consumer and a brand. Let me give you an example. Amazon have all the competency in the world, fantastic customer service, great breadth of product, very transparent pricing, lots of product descriptions. They give you what you need. Do they demonstrate care? Now, on the surface, you'd perhaps suggest that they do. When you look at things like they pretty much invented personalization. They were certainly the pioneers behind a lot of the recommendations algorithms that we see. For example, Jeff Bezos once spoke of, if we have 4.5 million customers, we should have 4.5 million stores, that type of thing. Suggests some kind of individualization, some kind of familiarity, acknowledgement of individuals like you or I. But when you look under the surface, you look at all the GDPR fines that they've been breached for. You look at recently, they've been fined 900 million euros for pushing products in the very same recommendations algorithm that they created, pushing products that not that you wanted, but that had a higher profit margin for their own gain. They've been fined 900 million euros for that. So when you look at competency, can you help? The answer is most certainly yes. When you look at care, will you help? The answer on the surface, it feels no, which is why I think most people relate to them as repeat visits, not something that they're loyal to. They're not loyal to Amazon. They have a retention with them. There's a big
Okay.
difference.
I want to unpick. So I'd love to let's talk about Amazon for a second. Then I want to ask you about one that really does care to understand the difference. So I'm not sure I totally agree with that, because I always think that Amazon is one of the greatest brands of our time that no one talks about. Because actually, if you think about brand building, it's about an unwavering dedication to your values, and deeply, deeply showing up for them in everything you do. And I think that Amazon, for a period of time there, on the outskirts, everyone's like, oh, Amazon, horrible. Yeah, I hate to shop there. It's like, but they always do. And they always come back, because actually what Amazon do care about is the customer at the heart of the whole thing. Of every single cost saving we can have as an organization, we want to lay that back down onto the customer. And it's this cultural thing that beds it in. And I think it's a very powerful culture. And I think that they are just so good at sticking to that core tenet, that value of customers first above everything else. And actually, they've kind of got to where they are there. So
How can you
I
prove
wonder
that? How
whether.
can you prove that it's customer first and not shareholder first? This is
Uh,
a guy. This is, remember, like Mr. Bezos. If you're a Bo Burnham fan, I recommend you go listen to some of his songs. Um, but this is from a guy who said your margin is my opportunity. There's a ruthless individual backed by VC after VC after VC.
Well, and the margin, the opportunity is actually from the other retailers as much as anything else, that he can cut it down. So the only person that benefits from Amazon charging a lower price, other than Amazon, is the customer, and that's the ethos that sort of sticks on there. And I think that the other thing around the shareholder value is that they are one of the best examples of long-termism, as we talked about earlier. Like, actually, they went out and they said, we're not going to make a profit for, like, I can't remember how many years. It was like more than a decade anyway. And
Yeah, I
shareholders
saw
went,
some of
that's
those. And
insane.
yeah.
And it actually, what they did is they delivered incredible shareholder value, but they did that through delivering the best experience for the customers, because we keep coming back. If it wasn't an incredible experience, then we wouldn't keep coming back. Now they're almost in the Disney zone where they actually captured us, and that it feels like it's quite a different brand today. But where I'm always fascinated is how brands came to be the behemoths that they are today, and I
Mm.
feel that Amazon is a great brand. It's not a brand that I feel any affinity to, but how they get to where they are there, I think there's something
Isn't that
interesting
the
in that.
difference though, Paul? Like, so when I talk about competence and care or retention and loyalty, do you place them in that latter category? It doesn't feel like you do from what you're saying. Do you place them in a sense of you have a great loyalty towards them, although it's you as an individual?
Well, yeah, well, I'm trying to think of an example that where I do care. So that goes into my next question. So give me an example of a brand that genuinely cares in a way that an Amazon clearly doesn't.
Brands that have more of a startup nature have a purpose behind them because they need to stand out in a way and something that's more aligned to their values, their beliefs. And so the issue is when that purpose gets lost along the way. And to your point, like VC's investment can detract you from that individual purpose. I feel it. I've been there. I feel as though I had a purpose with starting user conversion, for example, albeit an accidental one, or at least I had values behind that. And being the naive young first-time founder that I was, they got lost along the way. But in terms of a brand that has a purpose, I really like the values of Gusto. I really like the values of Bloom and Wild. And interestingly, both are backed by VCs. But I feel as though the purpose has remained. The example that I give all the time of Bloom and Wild is their thoughtful marketing movement. You've probably heard of that one, right? Where the whole Mother's Day campaign, opting people out if they don't have, if they're triggered by the absence of a mother, for example, then they won't send you communications or indeed like trigger you with any messaging on the website. I think that's a demonstration of care because it doesn't overtly go with the grain of more is more, which I think is what a lot of brands think of nowadays. Let's put more on the top of the hopper, we'll get more out. They actually focused on the quality of their traffic, of their audience, of understanding and having some level of empathy, demonstrating empathy anyways. And I think that's the difference. So I really like that.
And just to play devil's advocate, because you know full well that literally my company's purpose is showing there's a better way to show business, to build businesses, which is purpose led, right? So I am just going to play devil's advocate just for the sake of it. But if you look at someone like Bloom and Wild, it's a company that was born as I think it was Harvard Business School project that had evolved into it. Like where is their opportunity? Like, well, there's great delivery in other places, but actually a D2C flower brand could be started. Thoughtful marketing movement was 10 years after they launched. What was the purpose at the core that makes you feel that connection to that brand or to Gusto?
Gusto, I don't know how you say it. Gusto. I think Gusto. Did I say Gusto? You're more posh than me.
Yeah, I have no idea. No idea. So what is? Yeah, whichever it is. Like,
well, so this is fascinating, right? Because does it not come down to perception, like individual perception? We all know that PR is such a wonderful technique, and that can mold and even manipulate our thoughts on different brands. So I don't know whether this comes down to subjective opinion, because at the moment, essentially when we talk about loyalty, when we talk about Maslow's self-actualization, you're talking about the individual and the way they feel. I feel differently to certain brands than how you feel differently to certain brands. Perhaps I'm slightly more, I've been more manipulated perhaps by campaigns or PR than you have, or, vice versa as well. So I feel it's fascinating that it's an individual response. Again, it's insensible, it's intangible.
Well, so if we look at Gusto, whatever we want to call it, started by a fella who was worked as a VP in a hedge fund. Before that, he worked in investment banking at Rothschild. And so is it the case that he desperately needed to get his entire purpose in life was to get food delivery to your doors to try and do
Yeah,
it, or was it a business opportunity?
Jeff was the same. Jeff, Mr. Bezos also worked on Wall Street, and he threw away loads of ideas in the bin before he came up with selling books online. I think his first business was actually called Cavada, which somebody said it sounds too much like a is it a cavada? The like when you get, it's not mummified, is it? But when you get, like, I don't know, I'm gonna have to look that up.
Sounds like a
Cavada.
cult.
Yeah, it's a corpse. So his cadaver, he called it cavada. So someone mispronounced it. It was like, oh, that sounds too much like a corpse, and then changed it to Amazon. Because it was yeah, because the whole A to Z thing. Um, so yeah, the like again, I don't know whether it's perception, but I personally feel as though Timo, or at least the team at Gusto, have upheld their values. Their values, by the way, were one of breadth of choice, to make things easier for the customer, and making discovery easier when they're at home cooking. I don't think they've done anything particularly that I've seen that makes me feel, that demonstrates like a level of empathy that Bloomer Wild did, for example. I thought that's, when you're analyzing that difference between competence and care, I look at things like, well, how do you measure? What is your success for measurement? Because because I feel like quality can beat quantity, but when quantity beats quality, I think that's where the imbalance tends to come from. So I'll give you the example of Netflix. Netflix are well known for their personalization algorithms, right? It's 80% of everything that we watch on Netflix comes from one of their personalization recommendations. Okay. Now, when they came up with that, their hypothesis was not one of how many recommendations do you watch. Their hypothesis was one of retention, i.e., if we create a personalized recommendations algorithm for our customers, can we uh, increase the retention of how much they stay with us? Do you know how long it took them to prove that that was a thing, to prove the correlation between the two? 10
Tell me.
years, 10 whole years. And they had a big bet, and they looked at little proxy metrics that inferred that over that 10-year period, and it just became the behemoth that it is nowadays. Not because of their recommendations algorithm, I'm not saying that, but they place so much money within their recommendations algorithm, so much investment. You've heard of like the big Netflix prize and everything, where they even out crowdsourced ideas.
No,
Um,
tell us that.
well, basically, they they crowdsourced like this competition called the Big Netflix Prize, where other people would come in and try and beat the recommendations algorithm that they had. So their recommendations algorithm works off the most minute of signals. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of attributes that go into you may also like, basically, or what they show you. And now that's extended to even the artwork. So the artwork, if you see like How to Train Your Dragon, there'll be 6 or 7 different components of that. And based on what you might be more affiliated towards. So take like the hero story. If you watch a lot of films with heroes in it, the hero of How to Train Your Dragon might be front and center. Whereas if you're more into your sci-fi, the dragon might be more front and center of the artwork. Anyway, the Big Netflix Prize was one where they crowdsourced ideas as a competition where you'd win £1 million if you could beat their recommendations algorithm. And they weighted you on different scores. Someone did it, but only just.
Well, we're talking about care, and we're talking about
Yeah.
the brands that do care and actually how they sort of show up. And like,
We speak
I
about
think I
quality
like core to
metrics.
this ethos
Yeah.
is the idea that the brands that care the most will the ones that win. They don't make those shortcuts about cutting costs so that the products are, basically almost as good, but they've saved themselves a load of money. They're caring about the individual's experience. They're caring about the way that they send their marketing communications, like with the thoughtful marketing. They're caring about how they show up for them. They care just about they're empathetic in the way that they're brand building, which I know for you is like as a personalization guru, like how did that connect to the reason why you grew a beard?
It's a very it's a very leading question. Um, well, I wrote a book, and for those who don't know, it took me probably like 18 months. I interviewed 150 people to do that. and I ended up growing like a beard, which was an anti-motivator. It was something that I hated, my wife hated, my kids hated, and it looked like this. Look at that. Um, and it basically helped me push through the book. You know, Paul, if you're ever wanting to write a book in the future, well, I recommend something to motivate you. I don't recommend that is a beard, though.
And what, like, in terms of actually the main sort of thesis of it, like, what was the most
Right.
interesting thing that evolved for you when you were going through
The
that
non-beard
process?
stuff. Well,
Yeah.
the book is called The Person in Personalization. I don't know about you. I feel as though personalization has been this thing that we've spoken about for 20 years. Like we're continually on the hype cycle of 2021, year of personalization, 2022, the year of personalization, 2020. We were probably saying this in the 90s as well. And I was at first very curious as to why no every year is the year of personalization, yet no year is. Why the reality never meets the hype. And I feel there's barriers in the way. There's about 40 barriers that are in the way between, the hype and the reality, which I found really interesting. But the one conclusion I came to is that the way we measure personalization creates the way we approach it. And that is one where immediate value is needed to be seen before we personalize in a way that we should be personalizing. Let us not forget that personalization is designed to be personal. Okay, what is being personal? Well, for me, it's about acknowledgement, familiarity, uh, intimacy, authenticity, care, and listening.
Uh, the thing that I was finding interesting here is like the idea between um, personalization and individualization. And personalization for me feels like a way for a brand to better market at you. And individualization feels like a way that a brand can collaborate with you. Do you agree?
Yeah, I quite like that delineation. I feel the continual need for mostly money has uh, molded our belief on what personalization is today, which really is just two things. Number one, segmentation. Number two, recommendations, i.e., the fact that we can curate stuff, thanks to AI, well, machine learning technically, but thanks to machine learning, and we can easily do something. We see that as being personal, which is just recommending something to you. I feel as though personalization is so much more than that. The second one is the notion of segmentation, where I think you can be personal within a segment, but segmentation is not personalization. The two are very, very different. Like I said, you can be personal within a segment. The notion of personalization is what you breathe, like your purpose, like the fact that, I know about you and I can be more personal with you, and I don't place any kind of attribution on those level of conversations that I have with you, or the fact that, I know that you enjoy playing the guitar, for example, or you have this great business and stuff. Like that level of familiarity, or indeed acknowledgement, or me saying the word Paul, 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 Paul over and over again to reinforce my relationship and connection with you. I don't need to attribute that. So we've lost that, essentially. Do I think there's a difference between personalization and individualization? I don't know. I'm a thoughtful chap. I'd probably have to reflect on that, I think. It's a nice delineation, though.
Yeah, so I completely agree, and I feel like there is another word that needs to be found for personalization, which is what you're talking about. There's something there which is
Well,
how does it become a two-way street? And
there was a
I think
word that was created to allow for like this, what I'm talking about, and that was personification. That was created by Gartner in 2015, I think it was.
aha.
Um, and the reasons why they chose that as a word, uh, to define it, was that it needs to use personal data, like you're personifying an experience rather than personalizing an experience, i.e., the notion of personalization has been molded into something else. We need to reframe it. What I actually argue is that we don't need a definition. There are far too many definitions out there. You can ask ChatGPT, you can look at Gartner, you can look at Forrester, and usually they're a bunch of, ironically, really arbitrary, really generic things thrown together to make a sentence. That's not. It's like the antithesis of personalization to some extent. I don't think it's a new definition that we need or a new name. I just think it's a purpose. Like, we're going to be more personal with our customers. Okay, what does that mean for you? You know, if Patagonia turn around and say, how are we going to be more personal with our customers? Well, it's about creating a connection between A and B. It's about having a conversation with A and B. And then everything is rooted from that purpose. I don't feel as though a term is going to change that, you know, a definition is going to change that. But it's interesting because that is the one question that I think I came up against the most in all my interviews, which is when I said, my question was generally, what is your relationship like with personalization, to all these 153 different experts? And the biggest question I got back from that was, what do you mean by personalization?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. So what can brands do? What are some really easy tactical takeaways that you would say to, let's say I'm VP of digital, insert brand name here. I'm hearing this, I'm thinking, all right, the two of you have just like waxed lyrical, talked about Manchester United and Disney and like different brands. Like, give me something I can take away. Like, what would be the three things that you think people need to either start doing or stop doing?
Well, I think the first thing would be listening more. You know, we tend to only capture the milestone events, the add to bags, the clicks on the navs, for example, in an e-commerce setting or a digital setting. You know, what about everything in between those events? And granted, they mean very little, right? It doesn't matter whether you filter on the shape of your glasses or the color of your glasses. Like, that means very little in isolation. But guess what, Paul? Collectively, those little things give meaning. They give context. They give intent. They allow you to understand where the user is in their buying stage, so you can be more appropriate to them, be more empathetic with them, not shove 10% discount codes off in their face, not tell them that 50 people are also looking at this. By listening, you can be more appropriate. You can demonstrate that level of care that we spoke about. I think for me, that's one of the biggest things that you can do. And I'm fairly biased with this, right? I run a platform that gives you the capability to do that. But, you know, there are hundreds of other examples of companies that utilize this concept of listening more or intent that just aren't within the e-commerce world. You know, Spotify do it, for example, Netflix do it, Google do it, a lot of the tech companies do it. We've used intent data within B2B sales for years and years and years. It's just not, for some reason, migrated over to BTC, and I find that quite interesting. So number one would be listen more. Number two would be review whatever your KPIs are. And what are you trying to achieve here? Are you trying to achieve that quick book that Disney were indeed trying to achieve? Or is loyalty at the top of your agenda? Because I think that balance between the two is really important to understand. Well, we are building for this metric, just like Netflix did. We are building for attention. You know what? If Netflix were building for conversion rate, for immediacy, then they would have made the sign off process of Netflix really bloody difficult. You know, they could have just had like, I remember Facebook did this. Do you ever remember this? There's a really famous example of making the offboarding process of Facebook really complex and complicated and actually psychologically manipulative. So whenever you were to say, I want to leave Facebook, they take you through like this 20-stage process of all your friends would miss you. And then some recent posts of Tara saying, "Hi, David, how are you doing?" You know, that she probably posted 2 years ago, or something like creating FOMO that was, again, probably worked in the immediate sense of the word of reducing the number of people that did offboard. But in the long sense of the word, in terms of retention, well, I don't know, that it feels manipulative. It doesn't
And
feel like, do you know, there's a
And with
very
regards
famous,
to the thoughtful marketing side of that, I think there's one of the major parts that a lot of these social networks started to encounter after a few years is when people died. And then their loved ones had to then go into their accounts and deal with that. And now have entire teams dedicated with this scenario because there's millions and millions of people that are dying who are on social media, social media accounts, and that was one of those things. If you go through a 20-stage program to off board when you're a loved one hearing these different things, it's agonizing.
it's competency without the care. If we're taking those two things as solutions. So you asked for three things. So listening was one, KPIs is another, and the third I would say is purpose. Just what is the purpose of your business, of what you're trying to do, or even to the minutiae of the experience that you're trying to deliver. Again, we'll take the social proof example of 50 people looking at this. What are you trying to do with that? Are you either A, trying to persuade people to purchase more within the session, but by also doing that by virtue, are you trying to incite fear on the 98% that won't convert and that are viewing that element? Like telling me that 50 people are looking at this when I don't have an intention to purchase with you feels wrong, feels
Are you
unethical.
trying to tell me that there aren't actually 50 people looking at this when I'm there and it's all
You know
fake?
what? Feel free on some businesses to right click, inspect element, look in the code, and you'll see that sometimes it's hard coded for those lazy people that are trying to do it. I find it incredibly unethical.
Okay, so we have up front, we've got like
Yeah, listening, KPIs,
listening
and purpose.
and purpose. That's very powerful. David, this has been fascinating, a very wide ranging and diverse conversation, but at the heart of it, it's all about the people. It's all about the humans. It's all about how brands show up and care about them, something which I feel very passionately about. So I've thoroughly enjoyed this. Where can people find you?
Usually LinkedIn. I'm probably ranting somewhere. From next week, they can find me in Orlando because I will be there because sycophant. Uh, and my book is on Amazon, and I run a business called Made with Intent, which does the first of those three elements, listening, which allows retailers to understand the intent of their audience. So yes.
Amazing. Right. Well, thank you very much.